Hello and welcome. How easily can analysis and prediction prevent a conflict or reduce the potential for disastrous geopolitical confrontation? A number of key global organizations have been thoroughly collating information that they feel might help potential hotspots from flaring up if the international community works together on a solution. The results include some surprises. The studies show that Asia and South America may overshadow the Middle East as new hubs for concern in the coming year. Then there are the usual list of corrupt leaders, factors causing economic instability, and issues such as sham elections and military coups that might change the shape of geopolitics. Pakistan and Mexico have the potential to continue a serious downward spiral, while Iran and North Korea may prove to be less of a threat to the West. So on today's show, we look at how global geopolitics is shaping up for 2011 and ask, where are the potential hotspots and what can be done about them before things get too bad? Remember, you can be part of our conversation. Call in with your questions and comments or contact us via SMS or email. Joining me to discuss the issues are David Gordon, Head of Research at the Eurasia Group, a political risk research and consulting organization. Dr. Gordon was formerly Head of Policy Planning under the former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Also here is Mark Schneider, Senior Vice President and Special Advisor on Latin America at the International Crisis Group, a non-profit organization which analyzes deadly conflicts around the world. Gentlemen, I welcome you both to the show. Mark Schneider, good to have you back as well.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Good to have you, sir. Now, Dr. David Gordon, I'm going to start with you and look at a number of the potential hotspots you've been talking about. Now, I know you've listed some red herrings, those that might not be such a concern, and I'll get onto those a little later. But let me start with two countries that both the Eurasia Group and Mr. Schneider's International Crisis Group are seeing as major concerns, Pakistan and Mexico. Now, of course, Pakistan's an obvious one for many people, but why do you think it's among the highest for risk?
Well, I think it's a combination of the spread of extremists outward from their basis in the Afghan-Pakistan borderlands, the northwest frontier, and they've made serious inroads into the urban areas in mainstream Pakistan, in Karachi, Islamabad, elsewhere. And then secondly, and I think reinforcing that problem, is really just the very difficult time that the new democratic government has had in establishing its bona fides, in becoming a credible provider of effective government services, etc. And so I think that combination of spread of the influence and I think it's a malevolent influence of the extremists with the weakness of leadership and governance at the center creates the potential for political instability this year.
All right. Mark Schneider, good to have you back. And I know the ICG has always kept an eye on Pakistan. I wonder, again, it's an area that both you and the Eurasia Group have on your list for 2011. What do you see as the scenario there?
As you know, we have people on the ground in Pakistan and throughout the region. And I think that our concerns are the same with one slight modification, and that is that there's no question that the Islamic jihadi groups have increased their capacity to move away from the border areas into the urban areas. And the concern is that the Pakistan military really has not cracked down, particularly on the Afghan jihadi groups. And as a result, you wind up with a situation where they still have a substantial amount of freedom of movement. And at the same time, there's no question that the government, the civilian democratic government, has had a difficulty in establishing itself and strengthening key institutions, civil service, the judiciary, the basic local police functioning. And so that's also a grave concern. And remember, Pakistan just experienced perhaps the worst reign of storms in perhaps its history that has really created enormous amount of destruction, and the government's response has been sharply criticized.
So there's already civil sort of discontent.
No question about that.
Now, Dr. Gordon, back to you on the issue of, and we're trying to get through a lot of areas in a fairly short span of time, but Mexico, of course, Mexico's had the drug issues that have been reported heavily in the media, but why is it so high on your list?
Well, I think the reason that Mexico stands out on our list is actually as a result of some of the successes of the attacks against the drug cartels. There's actually much more conflict between the cartels over leadership, and I think in this, the cartel, these contending cartel factions are upping the ante, and we greatly fear assassination attempts against prominent government officials or business leaders this year.
Now, you've got not only Mexico, Mark, but you've got Guatemala there as well on your list. And there is, from the latest reports, a spillover into Guatemala from Mexico, the Mexican cartels taking ground there as well. And I wonder to what degree you see Mexico getting worse because of that, and how Guatemala, of course, is on your list.
Well, there's no question about that. What you saw was that between the current years and between 2000 and 2008, the first stop for all of the cocaine shipments coming from South America was believed to be in Mexico. And in 2008, for the first time, more shipments stopped in Central America, and Guatemala a major part of that, than stopped in Mexico. They went through Mexico afterwards, but they stopped first there. And that indicates, one, that there was a greater degree of risk for the shipments to come directly into Mexico, which indicates some degree of government response. Right. But at the same time, it means that you're talking about Central American governments, which are far weaker in their institutional capacity than the Mexican government, whether you're talking about police, rule of law, any kind of military, far weaker, and therefore there's a greater danger that Guatemala, for example, could be taken over by a narco coalition. And as David said, you have now in Guatemala, in a sense, a replica of the cartel battles going on. So the Sinaloa cartel versus the other cartels, and the Zetas have established themselves in Guatemala, and that battle has already taken over many municipalities in Guatemala. And unfortunately, it's unlikely to be curtailed very quickly.
Now, presumably, the risk is for it to spread even further across Latin America too, the way things have been going.
Well, there's no question that the flow of cocaine north now increasingly threatens not only Guatemala but also Honduras and Panama as well. Those countries as well have shown increasing evidence of the influence of the cartels. And in a sense also, as you know, in Colombia, where most of the production has taken place and their government has responded substantially, now you're seeing a flow back, the so-called balloon effect, and additional cultivation occurring in Peru and in Bolivia.
A question for both of you, but Dr. Gordon, starting with you, Yemen hasn't featured on your lists in any way. Now, yet Yemen has been very much seen as a threat by the US and other Western allies.
And I do think that Yemen is a risk. I think that it's not quite the risk of instability that some of these other states have, because I think that the government has a degree of control there that it's unlikely to lose. But I do think that Yemen is a wild card, and part of it depends on how the U.S. response and what the relationship between the U.S. government and the Yemeni government is in terms of attacks against extremist groups. And I think, frankly, that the Yemeni government would like to use this enhanced relationship with the United States to crack down not just on extremists, but on other critics of the government.
Now, I see, but the issue, I guess, Mark Schneider, is that you have a problem getting people into Yemen because of the risks involved, and trying to get real intelligence from there is difficult.
No question about it. I mean, we've fortunately been able to have people on the ground there as well. And I think what we're seeing, to some degree, is the question of whether you can develop a counter-extremist movement that doesn't also result in increasing the opposition to the government, whether there's a way to strengthen the institutions in Yemen in a way that permits them to become more stable and better able to respond to these kinds of terrorist organizations.
Well, Dr. Gordon, a question for you about the red herrings that you have in your list. Now, that's a surprise for a lot of people here. You've got Iran, Turkey, Sudan, and Nigeria. Now, considering all the fuss that's been made in the US about Iran, and to some degree Sudan as well, I wonder why you think these areas might be less problematic than people guess.
Iran is really less problematic mainly because of timing. I do think that over the medium term, Iran is both heading into a direction in which the overall stability of the regime is going to be at risk, and also is heading into a timeline in which the nuclear program will be maturing to the point that it is likely to draw sharp moves to preempt it, especially by Israel. 2011 is not that year for either. I think that the success of efforts to slow down Iran's progress on the nuclear program, either through sanctions or through other efforts, have been substantial. And frankly, the regime is too strong and the opposition too weak and not coherent to make it a big challenge this year for the incumbent Islamic Republic.
But I wonder, have you factored in the referendum vote in Sudan, where of course the South wants to split from the North? We had an email on that, if I could put it to you, sir. It came in from Abdurrahman Abdo, who wrote into us saying, I don't see a peaceful separation of South Sudan from the North. We usually witness conflict or civil war after elections. I would be surprised if both parties managed the results of the referendum peacefully. So there's a feeling that it might be a hotspot for 2011.
Yeah, no, I think that there is an expectation that Sudan it could very well return to civil war. This is getting back to the questions that you posed at the beginning. I think this is an example of one of these cases in which a lot of effort by analysts, groups like ICG and others, to mobilize international attention to the potential for conflict has really worked, and I'm much less pessimistic now than I was 6 months ago.
Now, I was going to say, but it's been known the referendum is going to take place for so long. Why wasn't there some kind of...
the issues are, it's clear that the North doesn't want to see the referendum succeed, but recognizes that it really can't stop it, and that the outcome is almost sure to be independence for the South. And they finally seem to have accepted that recently. However, as David said, there are issues that have not yet been resolved. The issue of Abyei, the issue of the actual border between North and South, the issue of the distribution of revenues from the oil, much of which, almost 80% of which, is in the South. Now, all of those issues can potentially produce new conflict. It's in the interest of the international community, it's in the interest of Sudan, and it's in the interest of the African nations to find ways to resolve those issues over the course of the next 6 months before the CPA ends in July, in order that when Southern Sudan becomes independent, which is at that point, that these issues are resolved. And at the same time, included in that is a resolution of Darfur. Sudan is not resolved simply by virtue of having the North-South referendum take place peacefully. It's resolved when you have Darfur and these other issues also reaching compromised solutions.
Now, David Gordon had given us his perspective on Iran. I want to ask you to answer a viewer email on the subject of Iran that came in from Ansar Bakshi, who wrote in saying, Iran might be a possible locus for military action this year. The US and its allies aren't backing down, and neither are Ahmadinejad and his cohorts. I think they'll sell the war to the US populace by claiming that Iran poses a grave threat to Israel and the US. Can the US even afford to be in another conflict?
Well, I think that the US clearly shouldn't want to be in another conflict, and I think the US hopes that the efforts with the European Union and others to negotiate a solution on the nuclear issue, at the very least to move it from the point of looking like it's going to go to a confrontation, it looking like it's going to possibly be resolved. As you know, Iran just invited several of the members of the 5+1 to a discussion. However, the response was that the IAEA needed to send its investigators there. And I'm hoping that as this develops, that both sides will essentially decide that it's in their interest to look for ways to find some degree of common agreement. And you should also remember that Iran has an interest in Afghanistan being resolved in a positive way, and the United States has an interest in Iran cooperating in that effort.
Well, let's get a caller on the line from Germany. Paul, thanks for joining us. What would you like to ask? Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. My question is, I want to ask a good question. Why is it not good also that Nigeria should be divided into two, like the Sudan is going on the process of referendum to have their own independence? Because, you know, right from the time Nigeria has gotten independence, we have this problem of a Muslim and Christian. and the Muslims continue to kill the Christians all the whole time in the Nigerian,
Okay.
I think it's going to be a good thing if Nigeria will proceed to the same process and they get the country divided
Paul,
into two.
okay, well, what I'll do, let me put this to Dr. Gordon and also put it with an email, if I may. So we got in from Nigeria on this subject from Korede Aziz, who wrote in also saying, Nigeria is likely to remain stable through fraudulent elections. The only thing that might lead to chaos is if power somehow slips off the hands of the Northerners who control Nigerian politics, but I doubt that would happen. So a contradicting view there from our email. But what's your view on that?
So I just don't think that dividing Nigeria really makes a lot of sense. I think rather than look like what's going on now in Sudan, it's much more likely to look like the division of India and Pakistan back at the founding of the two states, because there are actually large numbers of Christian Nigerians in the north. There are large numbers of Muslim Nigerians in the south. The different ethnic groups are split between the two religions. And I just think anything like that would be a formula for disaster. I basically agree with the assessment of the writer who wrote in. I think that the electoral process is likely to be messy. We had some violence, I think, even over the weekend in Nigeria. But at the end of the day, I think the likelihood is that President Goodluck Jonathan remains the president and that the Nigerians muddle through. It's not the best outcome for Nigeria, but it would certainly avoid a much more painful process.
Now, Mark Schneider, staying with Africa, we had an email that came in from Germany from a viewer in Bonn. Yusuf Gamal wrote in saying, if the political impasse in Côte d'Ivoire isn't resolved soon, the country will experience an even more intensive civil war than the last one. Adding to the situation is tension between Muslims and Christians and the threat of foreign military intervention. Now, I know African nations usually are on the list of potential risks for each country, for each year, I should say. But I guess the difference this year is there are going to be elections in 17 African countries. And I guess Côte d'Ivoire is one that is on the list, the ICG list. I wonder if it's just an indication of what's going to happen again and again this year.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why you want to see Côte d'Ivoire resolved in a way that, in a sense, serves as an example for the other countries that you have to respect the outcome of elections and that you have to have transparency in that process and that the international community has to be unified in support of those processes. One of the interesting things to note in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, where former President Gbagbo has essentially refused to accept the outcome of the election, is that ECOWAS, all of the regions of West Africa, has gone to him and said, you must accept this outcome. And all of African Union has done the same. And the United Nations Security Council has supported that and issued statements. This is a crucial time for the international community to stand behind the democratic process in Côte d'Ivoire and pursue this and essentially ensure the outcome of the elections is respected. And that then would provide an example for some of these other elections where the question will be up in the air.
Now, I wonder then, Dr. Gordon, considering the economic austerity that the West, the US and its Western allies are going through, how much there is a chance of less engagement for issues such as the African elections, and how much that might actually shape the way things go? Yeah,
no, I think that's definitely a danger. I think that we remain extremely concerned about Europe being very self-centered. I think we're facing very serious budget cutbacks in the United States. So I do think that there will be a risk of these issues becoming less of a focus of the Western countries, and that could play out in a negative way. I think that's absolutely out there.
Could I respond? That's one of the reasons for the crisis group's existence, is to ensure that they don't disengage and to make sure that the decision makers, I was at the National Security Council today, that they take the issue of Côte d'Ivoire and they continue to pursue efforts to bring it to a positive resolution. The same as our colleagues in Europe and in New York, focusing on the other countries, and our colleagues in Nairobi in talking with people in the African Union and the countries in West Africa. The international community writ large needs to remain engaged on these issues, whether Sudan or Côte d'Ivoire or Somalia.
Although your list, Mr. Schneider, is getting a little tricky for the West and its Western allies, because you've got countries such as, well, Haiti, of course, we saw what happened in Haiti, but Tajikistan, Zimbabwe, as well as Cote d'Ivoire. It's an interesting challenge when it's so diverse. I mean, Tajikistan now as well.
No, I would say that, for example, though, before on Zimbabwe, again, you're going to come to another election. And you're going, the question, the last one clearly did not result in an acceptable solution. The question is, what is going to happen now? And here again, the difference may well be what role South Africa plays in this effort to try and ensure that that agreement that was reached 3 years ago is in fact abided by as you move forward.
There's one very interesting aspect of the research that you've done as well, Dr. Gordon. You've got the issue of the G0 world, which is, explain that, because that's a tricky one and kind of disturbing too.
Yeah, no, the G0 is the fact that, particularly in the aftermath of the financial crisis, U.S. influence and U.S. reputation around the world is weakened. But Europe is going through its own financial crisis, very internally oriented. The Japanese remain sort of not knowing exactly what to do. The rising states, particularly India and China, are becoming more important economically, but they correctly are focused on their own populations. China is the largest trading partner in the world, but it only ranks between 90th and 95th in terms of per capita income. In that world, there's not a lot of leadership. And without leadership, there's not going to be as much cooperation as there needs to be to address these international challenges. And that's what the concept is about.
But Dr. Gordon, are we talking about a military leadership? I mean, in terms of military dominance?
It's not just military. And in fact, it means that a lot of economic tensions are not going to be resolved. But it also means that in the military sphere, the potential for crises getting out of control is a bit higher than it used to be.
Right, well, Mark Schneider, I wonder, listening to what Dr. Gordon has to say as well, I wonder, to what degree Western powers have lost the high ground when it comes to the sort of global stage. Has the power of the US and its allies really started to fade seriously?
I think that to some degree the power has declined, but not the potential risk. And to some degree the interest. For example, I mean, if you say, let's say we're 20 years ago, and you might not have had on this list Rwanda. And we would have said, yes, Rwanda is a potential for a huge loss of human life. That's enough to require that the United States and other countries take account and try and intervene early in order to, using diplomatic and political skills, try and avoid that genocide from taking place. And that's where we want to see the international community engaged today. And David's absolutely right that to do that today, you have to bring in the Indias and the Chinas and the Brazils and others in that effort.
Do you think they've been engaged up to now well enough for them to see partnership with the West rather than seeing it as competition and our time has come kind of?
I think that there's no question that there has to be a greater amount of communication, consultation, engagement, and recognition that they have stronger roles to play. As you noted, I think in the past, President Obama suggested that India be a permanent member of the Security Council. Well, that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. And now it's sort of, well, that makes some sense.
A quick thought, Dr. Gordon, just with 40 seconds to go.
Sure.
Do you see any, do you allow for any unexpected areas of conflict? Do you say that there are areas you might keep an eye on? It's not on the list, but it may just turn out to be something to keep an eye on.
Well, I think we're concerned about Lebanon. I think it's pretty fragile in Lebanon. I think that's a country that I would focus on. And then North Korea remains a wild card because we just know so little, and the leadership transition could get very messy, and I worry about that.
All right, well, gentlemen, always a pleasure to talk with you. We've covered a lot of ground. I thank you both for your analysis and expertise in helping us to discuss these issues.
Riz, great pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for being with us. Now remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the topics and post your questions and comments. On the next show, art as a weapon of hope. A year after Haiti's devastating earthquake, the media is still focused on the pain and poverty. But what about the island nation's rich cultural life? We talk to artists who are breaking the negative stereotypes. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.